Make every exam your moment.
All right. I think this is all good. Let me turn on Discord because we have a lovely guest here in Discord. All right. All right, I'm getting everything set up. Everything's looking good for the one viewer who's here. Hello. Thank you for being here. Let's see, and I think Matthew is around. So Matthew, whenever you're ready, feel free to pop up. Hello.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Oh, just thrilled. Thrilled for another Monday.
Yeah. Oh gosh, my mic is like really spiking. Okay. Let me pull that down a little bit. I'm just so loud. Well, I'm excited for you to join me today because we are going to be playing a game created by a UW Milwaukee Media Studies Masters alumni. Um, his name is John Vanderhoff, and he has a bunch of great games up on itch.io. And this game, Wampus, is the first game in a series that is designed to be, he calls it the Muleniverse series. And it's a series that narratively extends the work of Daniel Bunton Berry's Mule economic simulator game. I have never heard of that game before, so I'm interested to read into to take a look at it once we're done streaming here. But yeah, a little NES style game should be pretty fun.
I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I'm interested, and hopefully I can get an interview with the creator. I think that'd be really awesome. Anyway, so I'm David Kutchik. I'm a second-year PhD student here at UW Milwaukee in English Plan H, which is Media, Cinema, and Digital Studies, and I am joined by...
I'm Matthew Carricker. I'm a first-year PhD student in the anthropology department here at UWM.
Awesome.
You got the full rank on me there, David.
What?
Second-year PhD student.
Yes, I do. And because I am in my second year, that means I'm better than you, as we know.
I wouldn't contest that at all.
So I'm gonna read our land acknowledgement. Oh gosh, I had it up, but of course now it's all over the place. Just a second. Land acknowledgement.
You know, there's a bot now in the Discord.
Yeah.
In the streamer feed, and you can put in hashtag land acknowledgement.
I just did that in in the fan game Follies one, but obviously that didn't work. Whoopsie. Let's see. I know I saw it somewhere.
It should just be a pinned message, you know?
Yeah, it was a pinned message recently. Okay, here we go. So we acknowledge that in Milwaukee, we live and work on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homelands along the southwest shores of Michigami, which is part of North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnick rivers meet. and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. And that is that. Also, if you're watching the VOD or you're in chat now, every week I'm trying to link in something just more than the land acknowledgement, just when it comes to Indigenous people in the United States. And I think it's really appropriate with what we're talking about today, which is partly about colonialism. And so there's a link about ending violence against Native women, which is statistically much higher than any other population in the U.S. So all good research there, and donations you can send there as well. Cool, let's get started with the actual game today and chat about it a little bit. I'm going to turn on the sound of the game.
Yeah, so FYI, I don't have any game sound because it'll just loop back in because I'm listening to you through Discord, so...
Oh, right, I can share my game on Discord.
But that would be ideal, unless it doesn't, you know...
I don't think it'll affect my file, or the stream at all.
Or your bandwidth.
Can you hear it on your end?
Yes.
On the Discord? Cool. Yeah, so all of the music for the game is developed by Ben Burns, who is an awesome 8-bit and all that kind of stuff composer. So let's get started. Hopefully it doesn't glitch too much out on me. But, ooh. Okay.
Interesting.
Here we go. So every year, galactic settlers descend on the planet Errata to pillage and plunder its natural resources. It does this weird thing. This is an interesting design for an NES-style game to make you listen to dialogue. It's like this invisible wall that doesn't go down until the text is done. In their free time, the settlers harass the native mountain Wampus and steal their gold for sport. Alright, enough is enough. These invaders have got to go. One young Wampus is about to fight back and change the fate of his world forever. And that's all narrative we get.
So, very Dune-like, right?
Yes, yeah, very Dune-like, very, yeah, I would say that would be an apt comparison.
We've got this settler colonialism played out as a space opera, let's say.
Yeah, and it's a very Legend of Zelda-ish style, like top-down arcade adventure game with this settler colonial, Dune-ish style narrative. So the Settlers Union is telling people to hunt the Wampus and steal their gold. I've only looked at like the first couple of squares of this game, so I'm excited to check out the rest of it. Spheroids are blob-like settlers who come from the roll-dough system. While they can be friendly, most are deplorable trash heaps oozing over Wampus land. Cool, and here is the ghost of one of my ancestors. The settlers have slaughtered our kind and stolen our treasure. Use your Wampus claws with the B button to strike back and save Errata. Pretty classic NES, because, obviously the technical capabilities of the NES are not all that high, right? So it's a pretty standard thing where, the text is very short, very straight and to the point, right? It gives you just a little bit of narrative, and then it's like, hey, also use this to go kill enemies.
I think, I take a lot of inspiration from the brevity, especially when it comes to TTRPGs, where I can be quite verbose and long-winded, but actually there's an imaginative empowerment, right, in the brevity of game narratives, because they inspire you to fill in the blanks.
Definitely, and I think especially for games like this where it's made, John Vanderhoff is like an instructor, he's a professor at a university, right? And so when you're making games as your side job, I think brevity is even more crucial, because you can't really spend a whole lot of time planning out these very complex narrative elements. It's kind of like, how can you be as succinct as possible while still giving enough story to like understand what's happening, but not so much that it like completely takes over your life as a creator.
Of course,
Which I'm
yeah.
sure you've run into.
Well, I don't have a life for it to take over, so.
Your life is XLDMs.
Pokemon
Oh,
Mango.
yeah. All right, so this is I think my first like boss fight. It looks like. Ugh.
Yeah, interesting how, you know, monsters are artifacts or setting as well, because you know it shaped the long legs, stomp on, blah blah blah. You know that it's not just something to fight against, but it's also a way to advance the world building in a dynamic way. You know, you understand the ecology, why the monster fits into the setting, and then you fight the monster, exploiting the strengths and weaknesses, you know, that it has appropriate to the setting, you know, and that's always an interesting thing to try and get right, or to make seem like it makes sense.
Yeah, and it's I think in this style of game, right, what you would usually get, I'm thinking of Legend of Zelda just because it's like obviously the most like apt comparison. But you would get if we want to call it like paraphernalia or meta text or whatever we want to call it, right? You get like binders or folders or you know, little magazines with descriptions of the enemies, right? So it'd be like with the original Legend of Zelda, you would get like a booklet that says like this is what an Octorok is, right? Or this is what a Stalfo is, right? And it'd give you a little description of it. And when you're creating games like this, where you know you're using new like apps, or you know, people have kind of created code that you can then create games that map onto the NES, right? You don't really have that much of an opportunity to have like that booklet with you. So it's like either you can have like a database online with all of the enemy information, which again is kind of hard to do on something like Itch.io, because it's not really meant to be a database in that way.
Yeah.
So then you kind of have to convert it to in-game, which wasn't a practice of the NES, you know, back then.
Well, neither was the first one, right? Because there wasn't an internet database that you could look up during the NES era.
Yep, exactly.
So both of them are in a way sort of what did Ren say the other day? Ahistorical.
Oh yeah, definitely. All right.
So the other aspect about those monsters as artifacts, which is interesting, is they're also artifacts of the constraints of the digital or mechanical system, because they, you know, the monsters, they move through two planes. You know, it's a 2D game, right? So they all move through two planes. They have movement of varying speeds. And they can have a ranged attack, or when they touch you, it's bad, you know. And all of these are all in a way related between the story that the game designers spelling out through these artifacts. But these artifacts are also shaped by the inherent constraints and affordances of the gaming system.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I just died. That's okay. I wanted to read these signs anyways. Flapper, electric plant, no trespassing. Okay. Flappers are from the Board Drop Galaxy. They're large and charged, travel in packs, and fully a feathery greed. They guard their nest egg fiercely. Yeah, it is kind of this Dune-style narrative where you have all of these different alien communities, like, descending. Right, because this... Although, right, in Dune, it's a little... I mean, I haven't completely read all of Dune, but, like, the resources... It seems interesting that the resources here are all, like, money-oriented, right? They're, like, gold or that kind of thing. And I think, like, in other sci-fi, right, sometimes it's less about material... I don't know what I'm trying to say, but...
But also, think again about that sort of definition of monster as an artifact. The resources as well all have to be big, bulky, and distinctive sprites that can fit into one square. So you've got coins are inevitably a good one. Batteries there, we're in a power plant, you know. And so that's what's going to govern, and that's why, you know, the arcade style is about simplification, right? Because of rendering constraints. And what it's quite funny that resources are distilled into coins when actually you're talking about commodities usually. But it's hard to render commodity sprites as well. So, but I think, you know, I don't think that that's the ruling ways in which these decisions are made, but I think it's still, it can't be reduced beyond the constraints inherent in the system. And it's interesting that, you know, this is a contemporary game, right, but made in that old system, because then you have, instead of like the constraints of a historical period which sort of have this narrative of putting constraints on storytelling in only a reductive way, clearly this guy's chosen to use this retrograde way to tell a story because of, well, we think of constraints as creative, right? Following Ian Bogost, but also yeah, the affordances of the system as well. Maybe even it's placed biographically for the creator as well.
Absolutely, right. Right. I think Ian Bogost, right? And basically it's kind of a common kind of unspoken assumption, right, in media studies, that the affordances and the constraints of the medium is part, especially with games, right, is part of how like effective creators use those constraints to not make something that is like what am I trying to say? It's early. It's a Monday. I know it's noon, but it's still early for me. Right, but creative use of constraints can help, you know, bring out the artfulness, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, of the system that you're playing within. And also play, you know, in general, if in terms of quote unquote the real world, right, is also constituted by those constraints. I've only had one cup of coffee. I'm too tired for intellectual discussions.
I was just thinking about a second cup of coffee, actually. No, that's good, yeah. And now I guess we should bring that discussion back to a close reading of the text.
Sure.
So,
I think something that's interesting, and maybe it's simply because of the constraints of the system, right, or game design, or maybe knowledge of the creator at the time, because I think this is you know, the first one in the Mjolnirverse series, so it's the first major like game that the creator developed. It seems interesting to me that a lot of the enemies, you know, they're invading aliens, but they look a lot like animals with like slight deformations, right? And I think it's interesting when you have a narrative that's about colonialism, but like there aren't a lot of like humanoid figures. And I wonder how like we might think of colonial narratives that maybe don't center on humans necessarily, and how they relate to like human experiences of colonialism and you know, settlerism and all that stuff.
I told you before I came on stream that I was not talking about Avatar.
It's okay. There these little blue guys, but I don't think they're Na'vi, so I think we're okay.
No, of course, it's always an interesting question, because it's sort of like, well, it's this recreation of the ecological savage, you know, who live in perfect harmony with nature in an unproblematic way. A myth, right, which is created always, I mean, hermeneutically, right, the guilty reading of that myth is we construct these ecological natives who live in bliss with nature in an unproblematic fashion, because we as Western settlers do the exact opposite. You know, we live in with a relationship to nature that first of all externalizes it from our society in order to pacify it and open it up to well, the extraction of resources. Well, yeah, so, but when you, again, you know, you have also this sort of thing where it's like, well, it would be a bit bland if they were all humans, and also humans are a little bit too samey to render. And what is this, 32-bit?
16-bit, I believe.
16-bit, you know, and so being able to play with a broader range of colors and anatomical shapes, right, also means that you can have that eye-catching distinction, and people are much easier to categorize them. You know, if you just had humans, then this whole monsters as artifacts thing that I was talking about wouldn't really land as well, because the differences between the units wouldn't be distinctive enough. However, moving away from then those pragmatic concerns and back to the myth of the noble savage or whatever, yeah, you see it a lot, especially in science fiction, because then you have this question of different alien species and how they will engage with space colonial settlement of future human generations.
Yeah.
But then how much does the creation of them as distinct species and different alien races, you know, only rehash the problems of our own settler colonial legacy that we've never really learned to get beyond?
Yeah, I think this sign is really jumping out to me, like, as you were speaking, so I wanted to, like, stop here and pause on it. So Packers hail from the Silicon System, Silicon Valley, right? It's the instant thing that brings to mind. They love munching food and noisy Wampus runts. They make excellent farmers when they do not gobble their crop. Right? And this idea of this, like, of or alien species that, like, consumes everything around them constantly with no thought, no forward thinking, right, about their future. I mean, it's a lot of, it's kind of what I think of when it comes to, like, colonialism and settler colonialism, right? Is like all that they're concerned about is, you know, the amassing of resources as much as possible, you know. So it's just an interesting little parallel to what we think of.
That moral economy in which you're supposed to extract and have as much and amass, right, as much surplus as possible, because that is wealth. And so when other people just sort of like live in a subsistence fashion, do not accumulate surplus, they are bad within that moral economy.
Yeah. Yes. Oh my gosh. You know, like, this is just what I've been thinking about lately, just because I've been walking around my neighborhood and there's so many of these fancy houses here, right? And, like, people that are renters are, like, because you're not accumulating wealth, right? It's like, when you're an adult and you're renting an apartment, it's like a moral failing because you're not accumulating wealth, right? And I think that's kind of like an extension of that, right? Where it's like, you should be residing in and taking from places that build wealth, because you need to have something in your coffers at all times, right? And the opposition against subsistence as a mode of, or a style, or whatever you want to call it, of, you know, engaging with the world, is something that a lot of these, like, these, like, colonial settings, right, or colonial myths stem from. Because if you're going to be able to justify that you can do all these horrible things to all these people, it has to be for this, like, greater ideal of something, and that might mean, like, wealth, you know?
And that's the inherent irony or paradox of it, right? Which is that somehow through this moral economy, hoarding, right, surplus wealth, is somehow equated with prudence. You know, and the idea that actually that's a very wise thing to do, to accumulate and hoard a surplus of wealth and resources, is actually by doing that you're not like you're not in a way guzzling, right, like these aliens, just because you're not And so it's ironic because ultimately, you shouldn't have to hoard wealth. That just makes you a greedy dragon. It doesn't make you a prudent, um, a prudent moral person.
Yeah, it's interesting how you say that, right? Because I think of instantly like the 7 deadly sins, right? And gluttony and greed are 2 of them, right? And even though if you have a lot of wealth, you're probably pretty gluttonous and pretty greedy, right? Like I'm thinking like millionaires and billionaires, right? For some reason, that gets a pass because it's like, it's not, we don't posit it, or like the discourse around it isn't like a thing of greediness. It's a thing of like intelligence. Right, you're able to save all of these things because you're intelligent and you can use them for the future, which I think is just, I don't know, it's an interesting way of like kind of getting around the greediness part, right, in order to justify how much wealth you have.
But that's the interesting thing about sort of studying ideology, right? Is taking a supposedly naturalistic account of how things work, and then engaging with it critically in order to expose the fact that, you know, where you thought that narrative was normal or unproblematic, or if you think about it as a rope like straight and taut, actually once you explore it, you see it's full of all knots and things, and just in order to try and hold that piece of rope together. And on closer inspection, it's not an unproblematic, you know, objective view of the world or how somebody should engage with it, but it's actually a highly problematic but also artificial and coordinated myth, right? In order to persuade people that is the way that the world and or somebody's actions within it should be.
Yeah, that's how it works, you know.
And so to return this to a close reading of the game that we're playing, I mean, right now you're making your way through a power plant, right? And I think there's eggs, right? There's birds there with eggs that they are.
These are the guys. They're like hoarding all of this food, I believe.
Yeah, totally. So
Right,
it'd be interesting to see how it plays out, because are these guys the settler colonizers, or
correct? Yeah, it's like one of the alien groups that came down to this base, right? And they're kind of part in this colonialism of this world of these Wampus, is like they're like keeping all of the food for themselves.
Bastards.
The Wampus burrow ability. Press B, hold B and press A to burrow and avoid damage. Ooh. Interesting. I always think then, obviously, like, ludonarrative dissonance is kind of a... I don't know if it's a big thing anymore, but I still think it's worth exploring when it comes to something like this. It's like, how do you create a game that's kind of like thematically against colonialism, but then also so much of how games are created is like amassing wealth and keeping everything for yourself, constantly taking from the environment for your own inventory, right? I think it's this hard problem of like balancing the narrative with the gameplay, right? And how does the message of the gameplay correlate with that narrative? I think it's something that like is kind of, I don't want to say taboo because that's not right, but right, people are like, oh, that's kind of like a base level analysis of games, but I think it's important, even on something as simple as this, to investigate that, because if the game is, very explicitly about something, in this case, colonialism and environmentalism, right, I think it's really vital to investigate that. I don't have like a very clear idea about it because I haven't played the whole thing yet, but
well, if I'm understanding you correctly, then you could say that it's similar to Bitcoin in that regard, because you have on the one hand the inherent promise for liberation from already existing financial systems, and holds open the promise for a kind of future which isn't so beholden to a sort of vertical hierarchy within the financial system. But then the means of production of that new financial paradigm is actually, based in massive amounts of reckless energy waste, that you have to have computers working so hard in order to extract, right, with computing power, new coins, as a way to contrive scarcity, right? Basically, I think that's why Bitcoin requires such massive computing power, because you need it to be, its value in some way has to equate to the amount of effort that it took to, in a figurative sense, get out of the ground, right? But then another way you could look at it is how, video games afford hopeful new ways of thinking about the future and the present and an identity and all of that, but they are built on the back of horrendous labor practices in a largely unregulated, hyper-capitalistic labor marketplace, which sort of leverages people being able to be a part of this amazing new future making for deplorous working conditions, overclocking, underpaying, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think, right, so that work is precarious, in very tied to capitalism kind of ways, right? Like more traditional, like wage, exploitation, labor exploitation, and all that stuff, which is so important. I think what's interesting about independent game creation then is like you have also some pretty precarious labor, right? Where it's like these people are creating games and systems that you can like charge people for, right? You can charge people for it on itch.io, but you also have like that very precariousness, because at the same time the institutionalized nature of video game production is so set that like it's hard to stake out as like an independent creator, right? And to actually make a living off of it. So usually it has to happen like on the side while you're doing other work, which is its own precariousness. So but you also still have communities that are really supportive of one another. So it's like this weird thing where it's like, it's complex, right? That's a really dumb solution. That's a really dumb conclusion to what I just said. But right, you have precariousness, but in a little different way when it comes to this kind of production.
Yeah,
but it still stems from the overall institutionalized nature of game production and how they benefit off of wage exploitation and all that stuff.
You made me reach for my copy of Metagaming by Stephanie Bollock and Patrick Lemieux, particularly because of their critique of the indie game system as inherently a lie, because it sort of pervades this myth that anybody who puts in the effort and the time with access to minimal resources, for free on the internet, can create the game of their dreams, or can make their dreams a reality in a very liberal kind of account of creativity.
Absolutely.
Which elides the socio-economic position and the institutions which sponsor all of the most successful indie games. So like, I think, I can't remember the names of them. Super Meat Boy, is that one?
Yep.
And Super Meat Boy, as I recall, is a lot like Mario. Super Mario?
Yeah, it's like it's a high difficulty platformer kind of thing.
Exactly, and so they have quite a cynical analysis of the indie gaming scene, I guess you could call it, although that also is a very privileged scene, because all it seems to do is allow a certain kind of middle-class Gen Xer to reproduce their nostalgias. And then it sort of sells that as a promise to everyone else but actually the majority of indie games never get off the ground or fail, or you know, and it's really damaging actually to pervade this myth that it is for anyone to claim. If only they work hard enough, David.
If only I work hard enough, I can get my Stanley Parable and become famous.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and and like something I've been thinking about is like the rise of like the mid-sized gaming company. I mean, mid-sized gaming companies have always been there, but I'm thinking of the companies like Supergiant, or like with the like huge acclaim of Disco Elysium, right? You have these mid-sized companies that are maybe only like 20, 25 people plus some contractors, but again, it's that myth of like, well, if you're a mid-sized company, then you can create the game of your dreams and become popular and you know, create these games. But of course, as we know, there are so many people who stake out to do that kind of thing who ultimately fail and don't get anything from it.
I found the excerpt, if you'll permit me.
Sure, of course.
Yeah. So this is from page 32 of Metagaming, and they say while at the time of their release, Braid, Super Meat Boy, and Fez distinguished themselves according to their unique graphics, inventive gameplay mechanics, and the personal histories of their developers. These differences are underwritten by a structural homogeneity based on their relation to the North American video game industry in the late 2000s, as well as a much longer history of cultural colonization and commodification of precarious labor. As Simon Parkin notes, stories of sudden indie game riches are appealing. They have a fairy tale quality, the moral of which is often work hard and you will prevail, even though this kind of overnight success is often the result of an unreplicable recipe involving privilege, education, talent, toil, and timing. It is hardly a coincidence that Pajot and Swirsky's three primary examples of indie games were each personally funded projects produced by two-person teams of young white men. It is also no coincidence that these examples were all 2D platformers with clever mechanics and retro references. And finally, it is no coincidence that they made millions on Microsoft's digital distribution service. These coincidences coalesce the indie game, the movie, the documentary that they're analysing, because the film itself mirrors the logic of the marketplace by deploying the term indie game, the way to valorize only certain kinds of precarious labor practices, the ones that paid off.
Totally. Right, and a lot of what I hope to do and want to work more on is to think about how these like communities of people online who do not profit off of this, right? Like games like this where it's like, you know, you pay $3 on itch.io for it and that's about it. But it, you know, it's still being kind of propped up by these communities of people who are creating packages and applications where people can make these things relatively easier, right? So like this is made with like NES Maker, which is like hundreds of people have put in labor into just like creating a system where you can create your own NES game basically. And like, I don't know, it's just interesting how there's like the indie market and then there's like independent labor creating games, but that's not in the same indie market space as what they're talking about, right?
Well, a big thing that we could add to this discussion is Dwarf Fortress, which only recently entered into the conventional platform-based indie market on Steam, but has existed largely on its own through, you know, a direct website download and a dedicated community of people who financially support the two developer brothers. Again, both white with degrees, right? One in maths, I think, and one in history. But for whom, you know, this is making that game is sort of life, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know about the guy who made Cave Story, but it would be interesting to know.
Yeah,
so
it's like
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it's interesting, right? When we think about indie games that have success, often those with privileged status can get their feet in the door, right? Per se, much easier to market this and maybe like get a larger distributor to distribute their game, right? Or it's still kind of a boys' club.
We have
at some
to
step.
think about, yeah, totally. I mean, just in the same way that I was saying about how the myth of the ecological native lives or exists basically as a hermeneutic production of extractivist settler colonialism. At the same time, the myth of indie game production exists only as a hermeneusis of the conventional AAA precarious labor which produces video games, right?
Yeah.
In a way, the indie market is the worst of exactly two forms of video game production.
Yeah, it's like it's this idea that you can, as an indie game, have more control over your production, right? Or this idea, or whatever, right? But the algorithms of a place like Steam, even, right? Something as simple as that can dictate how successful you are, and that's something that's still like completely out of your control. Just to like think of one thing that could get in the way of people being successful, right?
Yeah, totally.
Not to mention all like the actual human actors who are involved in that process.
So then the third space of game development is the Patreon model. That's a way in which you can get the money initially in order to set up a good workplace environment for people to make games. Because I'm not sure. This is just what I'm just sort of sketching it out. But the AAA production has the money, but draconian factory like working conditions. Indie games have none of the money, but people are free to define their own working conditions. And then the Patreon model is a way that you sort of have a prototype, a proof of concept, which you can get seed capital for by crowdsourcing it. And then you can use that in order to set up your work environment, your employees, and produce your project. I mean, from what it sounds like, you have the maker of this game is, yes, an indie producer, but it's feasible because they are institutionally positioned, right? Within, he's a professor, you said.
Yeah, like a small university. So that comes with its own challenges and discussions of precarity. Yeah, it's right, because you still have the creator of it, right? Still has access to theoretical discussions of games, even if he never was like formally trained in game production, right? And so like that theoretical knowledge and institutional knowledge. Oh my gosh, I'm doing so poorly at this. That's okay. Right, as it has its own benefits.
Right, totally. And it's interesting then to see how, as a materialist, right, how these fundamental, distinct approaches to labor, right, means of production, all sort of trickle up, right, into the final product of the game itself.
Yeah.
As a new, and then you can bring in all of you can bring in all of your media literature ways to examine it as a final text, and also you can have it be a beloved, right, a beloved artifact that people can lose themselves in for hours. But all of that comes after all of the boring Marxist stuff.
Definitely, right? And I think I wonder if there's like an industrial history of I'm sure there is, right? But like what I was thinking is like, these practices didn't just come from anywhere, and so I wonder how like the development of the video games as a medium, how that developed economically, right? Like I feel like we know, for example, that the internet, kind of stemmed from government, maybe. at the very least, funding in some way.
Yeah.
So I wonder how like the modern. It's just always interesting to me to think of how like the development of games might be, how that is like situated within specific governmental interests as well. But obviously, we're far afield from that here. But again, I'm just rambling right now. I have no idea what I'm saying.
No, it's good. It's instructional. I think that a lot of early game development was probably hobby and craft projects of computer scientists who saw the inherent potential of the code that they were working with to make games. Usually digital versions of analog games that they were playing anyway.
Something like Pong, for example.
Yeah, so Pong is table tennis, right?
Mm-hmm.
But through holding Pong, you then create a precedent by which people can be inspired by Pong and not table tennis. I would think that that's how... Sorry, I'm just trying to flick through my binders and find a paper about this.
No, it's fine. Yeah, and I think, especially in game studies in general, I've seen a lot of... I hate to be, like, contrarian but, like, there seems to be a lot of, like, celebratory things about independent games and, like, avant-garde games or that kind of thing. And, like, I don't know, sometimes I just feel like I love talking about these kinds of games because they're interesting to me in a number of ways, both industrially and obviously textually and all that stuff. But like at the same time, the labor that is put into it is just so precarious, and I feel like something like Pong, right? Which is like the first major success, right? Is also precarious in its own way when it was developed. I don't know. It's hard to like fully support like an idea that these things are liberatory when also like the hobby has such a precarious labor component of it, right?
I mean, there's great arguments for a very cynical view of games as entertainment in general. From start to finish, they are produced and consumed within a toxic capitalist hellscape.
Yeah, but I mean. But now, I mean, basically every, mass medium is, even literature, right? Like, the most popular,
right.
the most popular books, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's
you're
because
right
of the publishing industry.
About it because, we are coming of age in a moment where the liberal and libertarian ideologies that justify the internet are also being used to justify our increased precarious conditions of life and living and working. And so when we look at these sorts of glittery avant-garde games, we're also looking at I definitely view them cynically. They sort of, the image of the building tall projection of a beautiful woman in Blade Runner, that sort of idea of something so tantalizing, but also impossible to reach, I guess. I mean, now I'm rambling. But
it's okay.
I think what I always find it interesting to think Seetine Nguyen and their book Games Agency as Art, because I think anyway a core concept that I find fascinating from their work is the idea that games because of their participatory element, but also their ability to be completely reproducible, right? Is the only medium that accurately captures our emerging digital subjectivity. And it is something innate to the mechanics of the medium itself, right? That they invite our participation, that we complete them, but only in certain ways, certain predefined ways, that games tell us something about the new agency that's emerging for us in the 21st century. So they are artifacts, once again, right, that play between the fascinating worlds that captivate us and the constraints of the medium that render those worlds and render that captivation.
So, when you mean digital subjectivity, what does that? Because I have an idea, but I've never seen it like defined anywhere. So what do they mean by like digital subjectivity?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to find that. I actually read it in a paper, I think, by Nguyen.
Because kind of what I think of when I think of digital subjectivity is that like our personage, right, is no longer just an analog existence. I think of digital subjectivity as like we're basically part and parcel with how we're engaging with digital technology at this point too.
Yeah, and
kind of like the Haraway, right? Like the cyborg in a sense.
But because agency is always at the same time institutional mobility. So you know, like Giddens would say, I mean, I don't mean mobility and our ability to move around. That's motility. Like a motor car is somebody's ability to get in and go anywhere, whereas mobility is our ability to move around within an already defined institutional structure. So think instead of a car, you're talking more like a train, right? You move between trains going on tracks within an already established network, right? So our digital mobility is, yes, always our individual desire of what URLs to go to and what to read and what to watch and stuff, but it's also the mobility in a way that we are able to move around on an already defined system of networks, institutional ones. And so our digital subjectivity is how we use these emerging new networks in order to develop our mobility and therefore our agency.
See,
and
I find
games in a way that they challenge us to develop digital skills, haptic skills, you know, whether it's controllers, hotkeys, typing, you know, modding, right? All of these skills are transferable into our more general digital subjectivity.
Definitely. And we were talking about, of course, as one does, talks about Foucault all the time. Because we had just read Discipline and Punish for one of my media classes. And we were talking about how, like, the internet is has a weird institutional structure to it, where it's kind of like most institutions, where it's kind of, if we want to use the Facebook metaphor of a platform, right? This kind of basic 3D plane where anyone and everyone can kind of wander around as much as they want into whatever destinations they want, right? But in reality, the internet has like a strict architectural component to it. You know, it's created and constructed in a way that, you know, a railway system would be constructed or a road system would be constructed, right? And as much as we would love to think because we own our car, we're able to drive around wherever we want, quote unquote, even though that's not really how it works in the real life, right?
Mm.
Internet-wise too, because we have the skill to navigate and use Google, we think that we can just traverse this 3D plane however we want, but the architectural component of the internet does not let us just do kind of whatever we want wherever we want. But the liberatory dialogue about the internet, like, evinces that we do. You know, or posits that we do have this thing when obviously we don't. And that can be the same thing about, you know, labor, as we were discussing it before, you know.
Of course, and it is an ideology, like we were talking before about surplus as prudence, you know. The internet does, you know, function on a very American ideology, which privileges the individual over the institution that gives its agency. You know,
absolutely.
It privileges the car and not the road system.
Even though the road system is, like, arguably more powerful and more determinative, right, than we want it to be.
That's right, exactly.
We can't see the roads for the cars.
Yeah, and so to come back to when we think about video games, they have inherent in them all of the skills that we need in order to traverse the emerging architecture of not just the internet, but also the app-based and other digital processes that are eclipsing more conventional routes that we have to institutional resources.
Absolutely. All right, well, I have to head over to my office hours, so I'm gonna do a little save state here, and we're gonna pick it up from here next Monday at noon for Fangame Follies. Thank you, Matthew, for joining in and rambling with me about random Marxist stuff for an hour. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. as long as I don't irritate you.
No. It's good to have one other person so I don't go completely crazy. I think that's always a good thing. Yeah. So we will see you next week on Fangame Follies. Yeah. Thank you. See you around.
Bye-bye.